French President Emmanuel Macron urged China's President Xi Jinping to reason with Russia and help bring an end to the war in Ukraine as the two held the first of a series of high-level meetings in Beijing. Macron arrived in Beijing yesterday and told reporters that Europe must resist reducing trade and diplomatic ties with Beijing, who is at odds with the West over issues including Taiwan, sensitive technologies, and China's close ties with Russia.
The Russian aggression in Ukraine has dealt a blow to this stability. It ended decades of peace in Europe. I know I can count on you, moreover, under the two principles I have just mentioned, to bring Russia to its senses and everyone in the negotiating table. And we will come back to this in detail. But we need to find a lasting peace. That is to say, a peace that respects internationally recognized borders and avoid any form of escalation. I believe that this is also an important question for China, as much as it is for France and for Europe.
Sweden's prosecution authority, which is investigating the Nord Stream pipeline blast, says it will likely be difficult to determine who blew up the pipelines connecting Russia and Germany in the Baltic Sea last year. The September 26 explosions at the pipelines connecting Russia and Germany occurred in the economic zones of Sweden and Denmark. The blast in the Swedish zone happened at a depth of 80 meters, and the prosecutor said investigating it was complicated. Prosecutor Mats Ljungvitz said the clear main scenario was that a state-sponsored group was behind the sabotage, but that an independent group was still theoretically possible. The White House says the Department of State was seeking consular access to Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, a U.S. citizen which Moscow has accused of gathering information about a Russian defense company that was a state secret. The Wall Street Journal has denied Gershkovich was spying. The White House has called the espionage charge, which carries a prison term of up to 20 years, ridiculous. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield also said she had spoken with her Russian counterpart, Vasily Nebenzia, demanding Gershkovich's immediate release.
The Department of State continues to seek consular access to Evan. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow has not yet received any approval for consular access, despite repeated requests. It will likely take some time, so a couple of days, before we have access. But again, this is a priority for this president, and we're going to be steadfast as that. We'll see you tomorrow, guys. Have a good day.
Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the United States is working through the process to determine whether Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich's detention by Russia is wrongful, adding it would soon be completed. While Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said that Moscow would ignore a letter from media organizations urging the release of the U.S. reporter accused of espionage, saying it was hypocritical. The wrongfully detained designation means the responsibility for the case would be transferred from the State Department's Bureau of Consular Affairs to the Office of the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs, raising the issue's political profile and allowing the government to allocate more resources to securing Gershkovich's release.
Exactly the same. From my perspective, from the department's perspective, there is no higher priority than the safety and security of American citizens around the world. And that includes those who may be wrongfully detained, held hostage, otherwise kept from coming home, being with their families. In Evan's case, we are working through the determination on wrongful detention. And there's a process to do that, and it's something that we're working through very deliberately, but expeditiously as well. In my own mind, there's no doubt that he's being wrongfully detained by Russia, which is exactly what I said to Foreign Minister Lavrov when I spoke to him over the weekend, and insisted that Evan be released immediately.
The Wall Street journalist should be released, and this is about freedom of the press and the importance of journalists to be able to operate and to ask difficult questions and to do their work. And many other allies have expressed exactly the same call on Russia.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said during a televised meeting with officials that there was reason to believe Western intelligence agencies were involved in what he said were sabotage and terrorist acts carried out by Ukraine. In a meeting of the Kremlin's Security Council with the heads of the 4 Ukrainian regions that Moscow said it had annexed last year, Putin accused Ukraine of committing crimes against Russian administrators, security personnel, journalists, and teachers with the help of Western intelligence services. Mr. Putin was speaking 3 days after the Russian military blogger Vladimir Tatarsky was killed in a bombing in St. Petersburg, for which Russian officials have blamed Ukraine.
Киевский режим продолжает совершать тяжкие преступления против живущих там мирных граждан.
The Kyiv regime keeps committing grave crimes against civilians living there. They show mercy on no one. They hit cities and villages with missile strikes, artillery and mortar shellings. Terrorist attacks are being launched on a regular basis against the officials and law enforcement officers, journalists, public figures, teachers and lecturers. Moreover, the neo-Nazis and their accomplices operate not only within the territories of the new regions of the Russian Federation, but commit crimes in other parts of the country too. There is every reason to say that the resources of third countries, Western intelligence services, are engaged in the preparation of such sabotage and acts of terrorism. It is imperative to strongly suppress propagandistic and informational aggression waged by neo-Nazis and their pro-Western curators, expose lies, provocations, doctoring of facts aimed at destabilization of social and political situation in LNR, DNR, Donetsk People's Republic, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions.
Контроль за ситуацией.
Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin has welcomed Belarus counterpart Alexander Lukashenko to Moscow for 2 days of talks. But in their opening public remarks, both men steered clear of the conflict in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said talks between both leaders was lengthy and meaningful and lasted well after midnight. Last week, Peskov said the two leaders would discuss Lukashenko's call for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. He adds that the Russian president is also planning to hold meetings with leaders of the 4 regions that Russia has annexed from Ukraine. Moscow is Minsk's closest political and financial backer. Lukashenko allowed Putin to use the territory of Belarus as a launchpad for what Russia calls its special military operation in Ukraine in February 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin's announcement came just days after Russia and China jointly declared countries should not deploy nuclear weapons outside of their borders. Stoltenberg also said Russia was becoming more and more dependent on China, partly as a result of international sanctions imposed on Moscow over its war in Ukraine. On the Ukraine's NATO bid, Stoltenberg said it had to be based on the country being independent and democratic, which is now challenged by Russia's invasion.
The announcement that they will deploy tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, to Belarus just after they signed an agreement stating the opposite just shows that these are empty promises, and what we need to watch closely is actually what Russia is doing, and that's exactly what NATO allies are monitoring closely. China refuses to condemn Russia's aggression. It echoes Russian propaganda, and it props up Russia's economy. China and Russia are also stepping up their joint military activities in the Indo-Pacific region. Allies have been clear that any provision of lethal aid by China to Russia would be a historic mistake with profound implications. Is facing, and we are also stepping up our. What we know is that Russia is more and more dependent on China. Trade with China has become even more important for Russia, not least because of the economic sanctions and the consequences of the war in Ukraine. And this is reflected in the fact that China is investing heavily in new, modern. We need to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation. Of course, any meaningful discussion about Ukraine as a member of the alliance has to be based on that Ukraine is a democratic, independent nation in Europe, and that's exactly what is now challenged.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin defended its decision to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, rejecting criticism of the move by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that NATO was the one expanding towards Russia, not the other way around. And therefore, Moscow had to take steps to defend its own security. Britain's Foreign Minister James Cleverly said Britain has seen discomfort over closer ties between Russia and China. Speaking after a meeting with ministers from fellow NATO members, Cleverly said the alliance would have to be very, very conscious of all potential risks and threats, not just to the Euro-Atlantic region, but also to the Asia-Pacific as well. Cleverly also said Britain would work to reach 2.5% of GDP spent on defense and urged other NATO members to meet a minimum target of 2%. He added that Britain would continue working on a route to Ukrainian accession to NATO in the future.
We have seen discomfort with how close China has got to Russia recently. The recognition that the world, the interconnected world in which we live, is a smaller place than perhaps it was in the past, and that therefore we have to be very, very conscious of all potential risks and threats, not just to the Euro-Atlantic region, but also to the Asia-Pacific as well. We made it clear that we're going to work quickly towards 2.5%, and we feel, particularly with the current circumstances, the current environment, that 2% should be a floor to which all members subscribe. The priority is about getting them the stuff that they need in the here and now to defend themselves, and we will continue working towards that route ultimately towards NATO membership. That's right.
The United States, Britain, Albania, and Malta walked out on Russia's envoy for children's rights, whom the International Criminal Court wants to arrest on war crimes charges, as she spoke by video to UN Security Council members. Britain and the United States blocked the informal meeting on Ukraine convened by Russia to focus on evacuating children from conflict zones from being webcast by the United Nations. The diplomats left the UN conference room where the discussion was being held as a Russian commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, spoke. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, told reporters that the United States joined Britain in blocking the webcast, so Lvova-Belova did not have an international podium to spread disinformation and to try to defend her horrible actions that are taking place in Ukraine.
Take the opportunity again to say, as Russia takes on the presidency of the Security Council, we will use every opportunity to push back on their using their perch in the chair to spread disinformation and to use their chair to push support of their efforts. So it's for that reason today that we have opposed their ARIA formula briefer, a woman who has been charged with war crimes, who has been involved in deporting and removal of children from their homes to Russia. And we strongly are opposed to that, and that's why we've joined the UK in blocking UN Web from being used to allow her to have an international podium to spread disinformation and to try to defend her horrible actions that are taking place in Ukraine. There will be, as you've heard, other ambassadors are not attending, and I nor any of my ambassadors will be sitting in the chair. We will have an expert sitting in the chair who has been instructed to walk out when the briefer that we've objected to is speaking. Thank you.
We have to head out. Thank you.
Это наглядная демонстрация.
This is a clear demonstration of their indifference to the fate of the children of Donbass and Ukrainian children. We organized our meeting to tell the truth about the situation from first-hand testimony from those who are involved in this on a daily basis. This is precisely why we were holding this informal meeting of the Security Council under the ARIA formula. But you don't want to listen to this. You don't. You're not interested, of course. It's not very pleasant for you to hear this, and it compromises your narrative.